Have you ever looked at your retirement account balance and thought, that number seems decent, but is it actually enough? Or maybe you've used those retirement calculators that tell you need $2 million to retire comfortably, and when you finally save $2 million, suddenly you're reading articles saying you actually need $3 million. Yeah, welcome to the psychological nightmare of retirement planning, where no amount of money ever feels like enough, and the goalposts keep moving further away no matter how much you save. My name is Roshan, and I spend way too much time analyzing why people who have objectively saved enough money for retirement still feel terrified to actually retire. If you've ever wondered why that retirement number that seemed sufficient last year now feels inadequate, or why wealthy people with millions saved are still working and worrying about money, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because today we're diving into the psychological and practical reasons why no amount of money ever feels like enough to walk away from your paycheck. Let me start with the most fundamental problem that makes retirement feel impossible no matter how much you've saved. You're trying to predict and fund an unknowable future. Think about what retirement planning actually requires. You need to estimate how long you'll live, what your expenses will be decades from now, what healthcare will cost, what inflation will do, what the stock market will return, and whether Social Security will still exist. You're essentially making financial decisions based on dozens of variables that are completely unpredictable. This uncertainty creates a psychological trap where no amount of money feels sufficient because you can always imagine scenarios where it's not enough. What if you live to 105 instead of 85? What if you need expensive long-term care for years? What if the market crashes right when you retire? What if inflation runs hot for a decade? What if unexpected expenses wipe out your careful planning? Every one of these possibilities can be true, and accounting for all of them would require saving amounts that are essentially impossible for normal people to achieve. Here's what makes this even more maddening. The financial industry has a vested interest in making you feel like you don't have enough saved. They make money by managing your investments, selling you products, and keeping you anxious about your financial future. So every article, every calculator, every financial advisor has an incentive to tell you that you need more. You need to save more, invest more, work longer, and worry more. This creates an environment where the target keeps moving and sufficiency remains forever out of reach. Let's talk about how the retirement number itself has inflated beyond recognition. 30 years ago, financial advisors said you needed about 10 times your annual salary saved to retire comfortably. If you earned $50,000 a year, you needed $500,000 saved. This seemed achievable for people who saved consistently throughout their careers. But now those same advisors are saying you need 15 or even 20 times your annual salary. Suddenly, you need $1 million instead of $500,000, and that feels insurmountable. Part of this inflation in required savings is legitimate. People are living longer, so retirement savings need to last longer. Healthcare costs have exploded beyond what anyone predicted. Social Security is less certain than it used to be. These are real factors that increase how much you need. But part of it is also fear-mongering and the financial industry's tendency to build in excessive safety margins that may not reflect most people's actual experience. Here's the brutal truth about retirement calculators that makes everyone panic. They're designed to give you a number that will work in the worst-case scenario. They assume you'll retire right before a market crash, experience high inflation throughout retirement, live to 100, and face massive healthcare expenses. The number they spit out accounts for almost everything going wrong simultaneously. This is why the calculators tell you need $3 million when realistically you might be fine with half that amount. But here's the psychological problem. Once you see that $3 million number, it's burned into your brain. Even if you intellectually understand that it's based on worst-case assumptions, emotionally, you now feel like anything less than $3 million is inadequate. You've anchored to that number, and it colors every financial decision you make. You have $1.5 million saved, which is objectively a lot of money, but it feels like failure because it's only half of what the calculator said you needed. The moving target problem gets worse the closer you get to retirement. When you're 30 years old and retirement is a distant concept, you can look at projections and think, okay, I need $1 million by 65. I can work toward that. But when you're 55 and actually getting close, suddenly you start seeing all the ways your plan could fail. The market could crash, you could get sick, your expenses might be higher than expected. That $1 million target that seemed sufficient for decades now feels dangerously inadequate. This is when people start extending their retirement dates. They plan to retire at 65, but now they're thinking maybe 67 would be safer. Then 67 becomes 70. Then 70 becomes I'll just work as long as I can. The goalposts keep moving because no amount of money provides the psychological security they're seeking. They're not just trying to fund retirement, they're trying to eliminate all uncertainty and risk, which is impossible. Let me tell you about the psychological phenomenon that makes this worse: loss aversion. Humans feel the pain of losses about twice as strongly as we feel the pleasure of equivalent gains. In retirement planning terms, this means we're far more focused on the possibility of running out of money than we are excited about the possibility of having plenty. Even if there's an 80% chance you'll be fine and a 20% chance you'll struggle, your brain obsesses over that 20% possibility and it dominates your emotional experience. This is why people with $2 million saved feel just as anxious as people with $500,000 saved. They're both focused on the possibility of failure rather than the high probability of success. The person with $2 million imagines scenarios where even that isn't enough. What if they need $1 million in long-term care? What if the market tanks and stays down for years? The absolute amount doesn't matter because loss aversion makes them focus on what could go wrong rather than what will probably go right. Here's another massive factor that makes no amount feel sufficient. Most people have no experience being retired, so they can't accurately estimate what it will actually cost or feel like. They're trying to plan for a lifestyle they've never lived, estimating expenses for a life stage they don't understand. This creates enormous uncertainty that makes any savings number feel questionable. You think you'll need $40,000 a year in retirement, but how do you know? You've never been retired. Maybe you'll need $60,000, maybe you'll need $25,000. You're guessing. The transition from earning money to spending down savings creates a psychological barrier that's hard to overstate. Your entire working life you've been accumulating. Your account balance goes up every month. You get a paycheck. You see growth. This feels good and safe. But in retirement, you're drawing down your accounts. The balance goes down every month. Even when this is exactly according to plan, it feels wrong and scary. Your brain interprets a declining account balance as failure, even when it's actually your retirement plan working exactly as designed. This psychological shift from accumulation to distribution is so difficult that many retirees underspend in their early retirement years because they can't bear to watch their account balances decrease. They saved $2 million, but they live like they have $200,000 because they're terrified of spending it down. They die with most of their savings intact, having denied themselves throughout retirement to preserve money they never ended up needing. The money was sufficient, but it never felt sufficient, so they never actually used it. Healthcare costs represent the single biggest source of retirement anxiety, and it's completely justified. Healthcare is the most unpredictable and potentially catastrophic expense in retirement. You could spend very little if you stay healthy, or you could spend hundreds of thousands if you develop serious conditions or need long-term care. There's no way to know in advance which category you'll fall into, so you're forced to either save for the worst case or hope for the best and risk financial devastation. The statistics on healthcare costs in retirement are genuinely terrifying. The average couple retiring today will spend over $300,000 on healthcare throughout retirement. But that's just an average. Some will spend far less, others far more. And these estimates often don't include long-term care, which can cost $8,000 to $10,000 per month for years. If both members of a couple need years of long-term care, it could cost over $1 million. How do you save enough to feel secure when one category of expenses alone could range from $50,000 to $1 million? Medicare helps but doesn't cover everything, and the gaps are expensive. Dental, vision, hearing aids, long-term care, none of it is covered by basic Medicare. You can buy supplemental insurance, but that costs money too, and it doesn't eliminate all the uncertainty. You're still exposed to significant financial risk from healthcare no matter how much you've saved or how well you've planned. This irreducible uncertainty makes every retirement savings number feel inadequate. Let's talk about sequence of returns risk, which is a fancy term for the terrifying possibility that the stock market will crash right when you retire. If you retire with $1 million and the market immediately drops 30%, you now have $700,000. You're withdrawing money for living expenses from this reduced balance, which means you're selling shares at depressed prices. When the market eventually recovers, you have fewer shares to benefit from the recovery. This sequence of bad returns early in retirement can devastate your long-term outcomes in ways that the same returns in a different order wouldn't. This risk makes people terrified to actually retire even when they have sufficient savings. They think, what if I retire next year and then the market crashes? I should wait until after the next recession. But you can't time the market, so you never know if now is safe or if a crash is coming. This keeps people working for years longer than necessary because they're trying to time their retirement to avoid a market crash that may or may not happen. The one more year syndrome captures this perfectly. People plan to retire, then decide to work one more year just to be safe, then another year, then another. Each year they find a reason why waiting just a little longer would be smarter. The savings number is never quite enough. The market conditions aren't quite right. There's always one more year of income that would make them feel more secure. This happens even to people with objectively more than enough money because the uncertainty of retirement feels scarier than the certainty of continued work. Here's what's really insidious about this. By working longer than necessary, people are trading guaranteed time for uncertain money. They're giving up years of their retirement, years they could be traveling, pursuing hobbies, spending time with family, in exchange for adding more money to an already sufficient pile. They're sacrificing the early years of retirement when they're still healthy and active to accumulate money they probably won't need. It's a terrible trade, but the psychology of never enough makes it feel rational. Social comparison makes the no amount is enough problem even worse. You see articles about people retiring with $5 million and suddenly your $1 million feels inadequate. You read about someone who retired early at 40 with $2 million saved and you feel behind even though you're 60 with $1 million saved and right on track for a normal retirement. The financial media constantly showcases extreme examples that make normal retirement savings seem insufficient by comparison. This is compounded by the fact that nobody talks honestly about their retirement finances in real life. You don't know what your neighbors or coworkers have saved. You don't know if they're secretly terrified or genuinely comfortable. So you're left comparing your internal anxiety to everyone else's external confidence, which is a recipe for feeling inadequate no matter how much you've saved. The inflation wildcard adds another layer of uncertainty that makes every savings number questionable. You plan for 3% annual inflation over a 30-year retirement, but what if inflation runs at 5% or 7% for extended periods? Your carefully calculated retirement budget gets destroyed. The money that was supposed to last 30 years now only lasts 20. You did everything right, but economic conditions beyond your control undermined your plan. Recent inflation has made this fear very real for people approaching retirement. They watched inflation spike and saw their budgets stretched thin while still working and earning income. They're extrapolating this experience into retirement and panicking about whether their savings can handle sustained high inflation. Even if inflation moderates, the recent experience has left psychological scars that make retirement savings feel less secure. Here's what's really insidious about this. There is no number that eliminates all risk and uncertainty. You could have $10 million saved and still face scenarios where you struggle in retirement. The goal isn't to save enough that nothing could possibly go wrong. The goal is to save enough that you'll probably be fine and can adjust if things don't go as planned. But our brains aren't wired to accept probably fine as sufficient. We want guarantees in a world that doesn't offer them. The desire for certainty in an uncertain world is what keeps people working long past the point where they've saved enough. They're not trying to reach a specific number anymore. They're trying to reach a feeling of security that no amount of money can provide, because true security doesn't exist. Every additional dollar saved provides diminishing psychological returns until you reach a point where more money doesn't make you feel any safer because you're not actually pursuing money anymore. You're pursuing the impossible goal of eliminating uncertainty. So there you have it. No amount of money feels like enough to retire because you're trying to fund an unknowable future. The financial industry profits from your anxiety. Retirement calculators are designed for worst-case scenarios. Loss aversion makes you focus on what could go wrong. Healthcare costs are terrifyingly unpredictable. Sequence of returns risk is real, and you're seeking certainty in a fundamentally uncertain situation. The number itself almost doesn't matter. Whether it's 500,000 or 5 million, the psychological barriers remain. If this helped you understand why retirement feels impossible even when you're actually prepared, make sure to subscribe because we need to talk about how to actually retire despite these fears.